They toasted a new beginning 3 feet from his casket. They said the store was already theirs. They said the house was already theirs. They said she was never really family. Not once. Not in 18 years. Then a quiet man in a gray suit cleared his throat. Everything they'd already spent stopped being theirs at all. They didn't know he'd hired a notary 14 months before he died. They didn't know about the trust. They didn't know about the forged signature. It was sitting in a folder in Greensboro. Bradley's name was on it. She knew. She'd known for 2 weeks. She stood there holding a glass of lemonade she never drank. She let them talk. But before the toast, there was the funeral. Let me take you back 6 weeks. There's no seat for you up front, Adrian. This row's for family. Carol Marsh said it over her son's casket, loud enough for the back pew to hear. She smiled like she'd done something kind. Adrian Marsh stood in the aisle of Overlook Baptist Fellowship Hall. Black dress. She'd owned it since her mother's funeral. She didn't move for a second. Not because she was deciding whether to fight. She was deciding whether it was worth the air. It wasn't. Not yet. She stepped back 1 row. She sat next to her husband's coffin instead of his family. Nobody in that room said a word. Nobody moved. Nobody looked at her. That was its own kind of look. My name is Adrienne Boykin Marsh. I am 47 years old, deep brown skin, my locks pinned back the way I've worn them for every shift I've worked in 22 years. I grew up in a choir loft 2 counties over, at a church called Mount Zion, raised by a mother who taught me that dignity was a discipline, not a mood. I've been a licensed practical nurse at Cedar Fork Regional for 22 years. In that time, I've learned one thing that matters more than anything else. You chart what happened. You don't argue it. You write it down, plain and exact. You let the record speak when your voice would only get you dismissed. I did not raise my voice in that fellowship hall. I did not need to. Cedar Fork, North Carolina sits 40 minutes outside Greensboro. It's the kind of town where everybody still calls the hardware store on Milrose Avenue Marshes. They've called it that since 1971, even though the sign says something else now. That store was the first thing I ever knew about the Marsh family. I knew the store before I knew any of them. Everybody in this county has bought a bag of nails from a Marsh at some point. It's the kind of business that makes a family feel permanent, like they grew up out of the dirt along with the pine trees. I married into that permanence 18 years ago. I never got handed a key to it. Thomas Marsh was not like his mother. I want to say that plainly, up front. Everything that happened after his death only makes sense if you understand the difference. Thomas fixed pipes on a farmhouse for a widow who couldn't pay him. He never mentioned it again. Thomas learned to make my grandmother's peach cobbler. He wanted Sunday dinner to feel like something I recognized. Thomas held my hand in hospital waiting rooms during my own mother's decline. He never once acted like it was an obligation. Carol Marsh was a different animal entirely. I remember the first Thanksgiving, 20 years back, before Thomas and I were even married. Carol sat me at the far end of the table, past the children, closest to the kitchen door. When I offered to help carry dishes, she said, "Oh, you don't have to do that, sweetheart. That's not really your job here." Her voice made it clear it was exactly what she expected. I carried the dishes anyway. I have carried a great many dishes in that family, literal and otherwise, for 2 decades. There was a night, early on, when Carol had had 2 glasses of wine. She got looser with her mouth than usual. Thomas was in the other room. She looked at me across her kitchen island and said, "I never understood what Thomas saw past her color, but I learned to look past it too, for his sake." She said it like a compliment, like tolerance was a gift she was still generously extending. 20 years running, I didn't respond. I filed it. I have filed a great many things. It wasn't only Carol's words, it was the small currency of every room she controlled. The maitre d' at her country club looked at me twice before pulling out my chair, like he was checking whether I belonged at the table. My insurance card got a longer look at the pharmacy counter than Thomas's ever did. The pharmacist's eyes flicked from the card to my face and back. Some private arithmetic I never asked her to do. There was a seat near the kitchen at every family gathering, year after year. Like there was an assigned zone for the woman who married in but never quite arrived. None of it was loud. All of it was constant. That's its own kind of exhausting. The kind nobody sees unless they're the one absorbing it. I remember one particular evening at Carol's country club with unusual clarity, maybe 8 years into the marriage, a fundraiser dinner. Thomas had been asked to attend because the store donated tools for the club's landscaping crew. I wore a green dress. I'd saved 3 paychecks to buy it. I remember feeling, for once, like I belonged in a room like that. Right up until the maitre d' looked at my name on the reservation list, looked at me, looked at Thomas. Then he said, "And you're with the Marsh party how exactly?" "I'm his wife," I said. "Of course," he said. His tone had already filed the fact away somewhere separate from the rest of what he believed about the room. He seated us near the kitchen doors anyway. The reservation had clearly requested a window table. I mentioned it quietly to Thomas. He went and had it corrected within 5 minutes. Embarrassed, apologetic. It helped. It also didn't fully undo the 20 seconds it had taken me to feel exactly where that man had decided I belonged. There was a night, too, at the pharmacy 2 blocks from the store. I went to pick up Thomas's blood pressure medication. The pharmacist was a woman I'd seen a dozen times before. She held my insurance card 3 seconds longer than she'd held it the week before when Thomas picked up his own refill. She turned it over once, like she expected to find something on the back, something to explain the discrepancy between my face and the coverage the card promised. She found nothing. There was nothing to find. She rang me up without a word. I drove home that day with my hands tight on the wheel, doing the quiet arithmetic I'd been doing for years. How many small moments like that one is a person expected to simply absorb? I never mentioned most of them. Not because they didn't matter. Naming each one individually would have meant living in constant grievance. I didn't have room for that alongside a full nursing career and a marriage I actually loved. I filed them instead. The way you file anything you can't act on immediately, but refuse to forget. One kindness stands out from those years too. Small and anonymous. The kind I've come to believe evens the ledger in ways money never quite manages to. The week after that fundraiser dinner, an envelope arrived at the house. No return address. $40 in cash inside. A note in unsteady, elderly handwriting. It read, "Saw what happened at the club. Wanted you to have a nice dinner somewhere. They treat you right. Love from someone who was embarrassed for all of us that night." I never learned who sent it. I kept the note in my nightstand drawer for years. I thought about it more than once during the 6 weeks after Thomas died. A small proof that decency exists in the same rooms as its opposite, sometimes closer together than anyone expects. Thomas saw some of it. Not all. He wasn't a mind reader. I never made a habit of handing him my ledger of small humiliations. What was he going to do? Lecture his 74-year-old mother into decency? Some fights you don't pick. Picking them costs more than winning them would return. I want to tell you about a night at the hospital. It explains something about how I carry myself. Something that mattered later more than any confrontation with Carol ever did. A patient came into Cedar Fork Regional's emergency department on a Thursday night, 3 years before Thomas died. An elderly man in respiratory distress. His oxygen was dropping fast. His family stood in the hallway, understandably frantic. I was the nurse who caught it first. A subtle change in his breathing pattern. The monitor hadn't flagged it yet. It's the kind of thing you learn to see with your eyes before the machines confirm it with numbers. I called it. I got the physician moving before the numbers backed me up. 90 seconds later, the monitor caught up to what I'd already seen. The man made it through the night. Somebody had been watching closely enough to act before the proof arrived. His daughter found me afterward, in the hallway. She said something I never forgot. "You didn't wait for permission to be right," she said. "Most people wait for the numbers to catch up before they trust what they already know." I thought about that line more than once in the weeks after Thomas died. I'd spent 18 years in a family that required me to wait for permission to be believed about my own experience, told, in 100 quiet ways, that whatever I noticed didn't count until someone else confirmed it. I'd learned professionally to trust what I saw before the numbers caught up. I'd never quite let myself apply that same trust to my own life, not inside my own marriage's extended family, not until circumstances finally forced the question. What Thomas did notice, about 2 years before he got sick, was his brother. Bradley Marsh was 44 years old. He'd never worked a day outside the family store, which might have been fine if he'd actually worked there. Instead, he ran the register when it suited him. He disappeared 3 afternoons a month with no explanation. He talked about the business like a man discussing property he already owned, rather than a job he occasionally showed up for. I want to be plain about one thing before I go further. It matters to how the rest of this unfolds. I'm not telling you this story to make Carol Marsh into a symbol of anything bigger than herself. She was one woman, in one family, with one particular kind of blindness. But that blindness had a shape. The shape had a name. I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make everyone comfortable. Some of what she did to me for 18 years was about who I was born as. I lived inside that fact every day. I'm not leaving it out of my own story just because it's easier to tell without it. Thomas found something in the store's books 18 months before he died. He didn't tell me everything that night, just that Bradley had gotten sloppy, which from Thomas was practically an accusation. He started spending Tuesday afternoons somewhere he wouldn't name. He came home a little quieter than usual, a little more careful with what he said on the phone. I asked him once where he'd been. "Handling something," he said. "For later. For you, actually." I didn't push. 22 years of nursing had taught me that, too. Sometimes people tell you everything the moment they're ready. Pushing early only teaches them to close up sooner next time. What I didn't know yet, what nobody but Thomas and one careful man in Greensboro knew yet, was worse than sloppy. A signature that wasn't his, on a line of credit that was. $61,000, borrowed against the store. Thomas's name forged clean across the bottom of the application. He didn't confront Bradley. He didn't tell his mother. He went and saw a lawyer instead, a notary named Walter Ferris, an office 2 blocks off Elm in Greensboro. Whatever he built there over the following months, he built it quietly, the way he did everything that mattered. The one thing he told me, the Tuesday before his last hospital stay, was this: "If they ever try to hand you an inheritance, Addie, hand it right back and read what's stapled behind it." I didn't understand it then. I filed it, the way I filed everything. I had no idea what was stapled to anything, or why it would matter, or that inside 6 weeks I'd be standing in a fellowship hall being told there was no seat for me among family. Thomas Marsh died on a Sunday morning in March, 11 weeks before that funeral. After 4 months of a decline, none of us said the real name of out loud. Not because we didn't know it. Saying it made it truer than any of us could stand. I was with him. Carol was not, though she told the church later she'd been there in spirit. That was the kind of sentence Carol specialized in. Technically, not a lie. entirely untrue. I called Walter Ferris 4 days after the funeral home took Thomas's body. I don't fully know why I made that call instead of waiting for whatever lawyer the family assumed would surface. Something in the way Thomas had said stapled behind it sat in my chest like a splinter. The kind you feel even when you can't see where it went in. Walter Ferris answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting for me specifically. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "I was wondering when you'd call." "You knew I would," I said. "Thomas told me you would call within the week. He gave you exactly 4 days more credit than you needed." There was something almost warm in how he said it. A man quoting a friend he missed. "I have documents here that concern you directly, Mrs. Marsh. I'd like you to come to my office, not the family. You." I drove to Greensboro that Thursday afternoon in my scrubs, straight off a 12-hour shift. I didn't trust myself to wait even one more day once he'd said the word documents. Walter Ferris's office sat above a shuttered shoe repair shop on Elm. 2 rooms, a window unit rattling in the heat, framed diplomas from a law school I'd never heard of, hung a little crooked. He looked exactly like his voice sounded, careful, unhurried. A man who chose his words the way I chose my charting language, because sloppy language costs people things later. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside it was a document, the Thomas Everett Marsh Revocable Trust, dated 14 months earlier, 4 months before Thomas had even told me anything was wrong with his stomach. 6 months before the diagnosis had a name we could say at the dinner table. "He came to me on a Tuesday," Walter said. "Told me he'd found a signature on the store's credit line that wasn't his. $61,000, Mrs. Marsh, against store property, co-signed in his name by somebody who was not him. He didn't want to accuse anybody without proof. He wanted, in his words, to make sure the ground didn't shift under the wrong person if he ever got sick." "He knew he might get sick," I said. "It wasn't a question. He said his father died at 51 of the same thing nobody in that family says out loud. He wanted to be ready before he needed to be." Walter tapped the folder. "This trust names you sole trustee and sole beneficiary. The store, the house on Milrose, every account in his name. Effective immediately upon his death. It supersedes any prior will. It's been sitting in my safe exactly as he left it, waiting for this Thursday." I sat there in my scrubs, dried hand sanitizer cracking on my knuckles. I read the first page 4 times before the words held still. "Does Carol know?" I said. "Carol does not know I exist," Walter said. Thomas was very specific about that. He said, and I'm quoting him now, "My mother will assume there's nothing but a handshake, because a handshake is all she ever offered anybody who wasn't blood or money. He wanted the trust revealed at a time and in a manner of your choosing, not mine, yours." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, a time and manner of my choosing. 22 years of being told when I was allowed to speak, where I was allowed to sit. And here was my husband, from beyond every conversation we'd never get to finish, handing me the choosing back. "The funeral hasn't happened yet," I said slowly. "Carol's already talking about a reading. She wants everyone there. She's been saying things to the church ladies about settling the estate properly, as a family." "Then let her plan her reading," Walter said. For the first time, something like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "I'll come. Somebody has to notarize whatever she thinks she's transferring. It might as well be me." I want to tell you honestly what I felt driving home that evening. Windows down on Highway 29. Summer heat pressing flat against the windshield. It wasn't triumph. 22 years doesn't undo itself into triumph in one Thursday afternoon. It was something quieter and steadier than that. Something closer to what I feel when a patient's numbers finally come back into range after a long, uncertain night. Relief with weight to it. relief that costs something to hold. I didn't tell anyone, not my sister, not my closest friend from the hospital, not even Nia, my great niece, who'd taken to calling me twice a week since Thomas passed, just to make sure I was eating. I carried that folder home. I put it in the bottom drawer of my dresser, under a stack of Thomas's old undershirts I hadn't been able to give away yet. I went about the business of grieving my husband, while an entire second story sat coiled and quiet underneath everything I said out loud. Carol, meanwhile, had begun what I can only describe as logistics. She called about the flowers 3 times in one day, always at hours calculated to catch me at work rather than at home. Our conversations happened in clipped voicemail exchanges instead of anything resembling shared grief. She chose the casket without asking me. A mahogany model, $4,000 more expensive than the one Thomas and I had discussed years earlier when his father passed. When I gently raised the difference, she said, "Thomas would want the best, Adrian, and I intend to see he gets it." Her tone made clear the decision had already been made before I was consulted. Like most decisions in that family, she planned the seating at the fellowship hall herself. She wrote the obituary. She listed Bradley's children as grandchildren of the deceased. She listed her own late husband's siblings as extended family. She referred to me, in the final line, only as his wife of many years. No name at all, as though 18 years hadn't earned me 4 syllables in print. I read that obituary at the nurse's station on a Tuesday morning break. I felt something in my chest tighten and then, deliberately, release. I chart it. I do not argue it. I said it to myself in the break room mirror, out loud, once, the way you'd check a pulse you already suspected was steady. 3 days before the funeral, a letter came to the house addressed to Thomas. Business correspondence. First Piedmont Trust. The bank 2 blocks from the store. I almost set it aside unopened, the way you do with a dead man's mail. Then I saw the words "second notice" stamped in red across the corner. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter, the same counter where Thomas used to make coffee at 5 every morning before the store opened. A delinquency notice on a line of credit. $61,200. 31 days past due. Threatening default, and a lien against the store's real property if payment wasn't received within 2 weeks. I sat down at that counter and I did not move for a long time. I hadn't told Walter about a bank letter. I hadn't needed to. The number matched exactly, to the dollar, what he'd told me in that office above the shoe repair shop. $61,000. The same figure Thomas had found on a forged signature, 18 months before anyone else in that family had any idea their whole arrangement was built on sand. I called Denise, Bradley's ex-wife. She still kept in touch with me. I always understood it as a shared, unspoken solidarity, forged from having both loved men in that family and both been quietly diminished by the women who raised them. I asked her, carefully, whether Bradley still went to Greensboro 3 afternoons a month. "The card room on Battleground Avenue," Denise said, without hesitation, like she'd been waiting years for somebody to finally ask. "He's been going since before we split. I used to think it was another woman. It would have almost been better if it was." I didn't say anything about the letter. I didn't say anything about the trust. I thanked her and I hung up, and I went back to that kitchen counter. I read the delinquency notice one more time, slower, the way you read a chart when the numbers are telling you something the patient hasn't said yet. I worked a full shift at the hospital that same week, the Thursday before the funeral. Cedar Fork Regional was short-staffed. I also needed the ordinary discipline of it, the vitals and the charts and the small, solvable problems of other people's bodies, instead of the large, unsolvable problems sitting in my own chest. A young resident named Dr. Okafor was working the floor with me that night. Sharp and a little too eager, the way new doctors often are. He was second-guessing an order on an elderly patient's fluids, one I'd flagged twice already in the chart. I pulled him aside near the nurse's station. "You're not wrong to question it," I told him, "but you're questioning the wrong variable. Look at his creatinine trend over the last 3 days, not just tonight's number. The pattern's the story, not the single reading." He looked at the chart again, quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. I was looking at a snapshot instead of the trend." "Most people do," I said. "It's the easier mistake to make. A single number feels like proof. It usually isn't. Proof is what a pattern does over time, when nobody's manipulating what gets written down." I didn't think much of that exchange until I was driving home afterward, replaying it the way I replay most conversations that turn out to matter more than they seem to at the time. I'd spent 22 years teaching exactly that lesson to nervous young doctors. Trust the pattern, not the single alarming moment. Read the whole trend before you draw a conclusion. It was, I realized, the same lesson Thomas's letter had handed me about his own mother. Not one cruel comment, not one excluded holiday, but 18 years of pattern, recorded faithfully enough that when the pattern finally needed proving, the proof was already there, waiting. I called Nia from the hospital parking lot before driving home, mostly to hear a friendly voice after a 12-hour shift. "You sound tired," she said. "I am tired," I admitted. Good tired, though. The kind that comes from doing something well, not the kind that comes from carrying something heavy. "2 more days," she said. "2 more days," I agreed, and we sat on the phone a moment longer, neither of us saying much else. The particular comfort of two people counting down toward the same hard, necessary thing. 2 nights before the funeral, Carol called a family dinner at her house, the kind of gathering she liked to hold when she wanted an audience for whatever she was about to announce. I went, because not going would have handed her a story about me she hadn't earned. Bradley sat across from me, quieter than usual, pushing green beans around his plate without eating them. "The store will need steadier hands now," Carol said, halfway through the meal, looking at Bradley with the particular pride of a woman who has decided in advance what a person is worth. "I imagine you'll finally step up, won't you, sweetheart?" "Sure, Mom," Bradley said. Something in his voice cracked slightly at the edges, the sound of a man calculating how much longer he had before a debt he'd been managing with silence finally came due in daylight. Carol didn't hear the crack. Carol never heard the cracks in Bradley. She only heard what she needed to hear. That was one of the truest things I ever learned about her in 18 years. One of the reasons everything that happened after the funeral landed on her exactly the way it did. "And Adrian?" Carol said, turning to me with a smile that had already decided the sentence's outcome before she finished it. "I do hope you understand. Once everything settles, the house and the store need to stay in the family properly." "I'm sure Thomas would have wanted that." "I'm sure he had thoughts about it," I said, and reached for my water glass, and said nothing else. Nobody at that table had any idea how true that sentence was. Bradley's teenage daughter, Emma, caught me alone in the hallway on my way out that night. 14 years old and clearly carrying something she wasn't sure she was allowed to say to an adult. "Aunt Adrienne," she said, glancing back toward the dining room to make sure nobody else could hear. "Is Dad okay?" "He's been weird for months. Not sad weird, scared weird." I crouched down slightly, the way I do with worried family members at the hospital, meeting her at eye level instead of talking down at her. "I think your dad's carrying something heavy right now," I said carefully. "I can't tell you what, sweetheart. It's not mine to tell, but I don't think it's about you or anything you did. I want you to know that much for certain. Is it about Grandma? I chose my next words slowly. It's about some choices grown-ups made a while back, I said. Sometimes those choices catch up with people. That's not the same as something being wrong with your dad as a person. People can make mistakes and still be worth loving. Your dad's going to need people who love him steady, whatever happens next. Emma nodded, not fully satisfied, but clearly trusting me enough to let it sit. You always tell the truth, she said, even when it's not the whole truth. I noticed that about you a long time ago. That's a very kind way to put it, I said, and meant it, surprised at how much a 14-year-old's careful observation could land, given everything else weighing on me that week. The funeral itself was still 4 days away. I want to take you through what happened leading up to it. None of it lands the way it should if I skip to the ending too fast. 4 days before the service, Bradley showed up at the store unannounced. That itself was unusual enough that Marcus, the store's longtime clerk, mentioned it to me later like it was a piece of local weather. Bradley spent 2 hours in the back office with the door closed. When he came out, he looked, Marcus said, like a man who'd been added up and come up short. I didn't know yet exactly what Bradley had gone back there to check. I'd learn later, from Walter, that Bradley had gone looking for the original credit line paperwork himself. He was trying to see whether anyone besides the bank had a copy of the signature page. He didn't find what he was hoping not to find. He found the opposite, a duplicate, in Thomas's own handwriting, on a sticky note clipped to the file. It read simply, "Not my signature, confirmed March 14th. See W.F. Bradley didn't know who W.F. was." He had 18 months to wonder. He never once asked his brother directly. Asking would have meant admitting there was something to ask about. I only know this because Marcus told me gently, over the phone that evening. He thought he was just passing along office gossip. I wrote it down that night in the small notebook I'd started keeping since Walter's office, the same kind of notebook I use at the hospital. Dated entries, plain language, nothing editorialized. Bradley found the note. Bradley knows something is wrong. Bradley does not know what. Carol called me the next morning to finalize the reception. The gathering she wanted held right after the burial at the fellowship hall. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd already spoken with the title company about listing the store's real estate for possible sale to a hardware chain looking to expand into Guilford County, just to see what kind of number we're working with for planning purposes, once everything settles. "You're planning to sell the store?" I said. "Well, Bradley's never been much for the day-to-day," Carol said, in the breezy tone she used for admissions she didn't think counted as admissions. "And frankly, Adrian, once things are settled properly, it makes more sense for the family to realize the value than to keep struggling with a business none of us are suited to run." I understood something in that phone call, something I hadn't fully let myself understand before. Carol was not simply cruel out of habit. Carol was frightened, underneath the cruelty, of something specific. She was already trying to convert an entire family legacy into cash. Before anyone could ask too many questions about where the money in that business had actually gone, I didn't know the shape of her fear yet. I only knew its outline. The way you know a fracture is there before the film confirms it. I called Walter that same afternoon. I told him what Carol had said about the title company. "She's moving faster than I expected," Walter said. For the first time since I'd met him, there was something like real concern in his voice. "Mrs. Marsh, I need you to understand something. If she executes any transfer, any sale agreement, any document purporting to convey that property before the reception, it complicates things. Not fatally. The trust still controls. But it complicates things. Complications cost money and time neither of us wants to spend. So what do we do? I said. We wait for the day she's already chosen, Walter said. She's already told you she wants to make an announcement at the reception itself. A toast. A proper closing of the chapter, in her words. She wants an audience for her victory. Let her have the audience. We'll simply be the ones who use it. Nia called me that same week, quieter than usual on the phone. Aunt Adrian, she said, Uncle Bradley's been weird, like weirder than sad weird. Mom thinks he's in some kind of trouble. What kind of trouble? I asked, keeping my voice level. The way I keep my voice level with a patient's family when I already suspect the answer. I needed to hear it confirmed calmly rather than feared into silence. I don't know exactly. But he asked Mom for money last week. Like actual money, not a loan you 20 kind of ask. She said no. He got really quiet after that. I thanked her. I told her to write it down somewhere. Not for me, for herself. So whatever happened next, she'd have her own clear record. Not just a family's later, tidied up version of events. The days moved forward the way they do before a funeral. Unevenly. Some passing in a blur, some stretching long and strange. I kept working double shifts at the hospital. The alternative was sitting in a quiet house counting hours. I needed my hands doing something exact and useful, while the rest of my life sat suspended. 2 days before the service, Walter called one more time. The reception's confirmed for right after the burial, he said. Fellowship Hall. Carol's arranged champagne, apparently, for a toast she's been telling the church ladies about for a week now. Something about closing one chapter and opening the next, as a family. And you'll be there, I said. I've told her I need to be present to notarize a deed transfer she intends to execute that day. Walter said. There was that small, dry note in his voice again. She was delighted to hear it. She believes I work for her. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after he said that. I looked out at the kitchen window over the sink where Thomas used to stand every morning with his coffee. I felt something settle into place inside me, cold and clear and entirely without malice. The particular calm of a nurse watching a monitor confirm what her hands already knew. Saturday, I said. Saturday, Walter said. Wear whatever you'd wear to any other funeral, Mrs. Marsh. Nothing about that day needs to look different from any other, right up until it does. I want to back up here and tell you more about who Thomas actually was. I think it matters. Grief has a way of flattening a person into a single outline if you let it. Thomas Marsh grew up in that store the way some children grow up in a church. He absorbed its rhythms before he understood their meaning. His father, Everett Marsh, ran it before him, a quiet man by every account, dead at 51 of the same disease that would eventually take Thomas. Nobody in that family said its name out loud for the father any more than they would for the son. Thomas started sweeping the floors at Marsh's when he was 9 years old, 50 cents an afternoon. His father insisted he earn it rather than receive it. By the time I met him, he'd been running the place outright for over a decade. He ran it with the same unglamorous decency he brought to everything else in his life. He extended credit to families who needed a part before payday. He fixed things for free that other men would have charged for. He kept a coffee can by the register. Customers could leave spare change for whoever needed gas money to get to a job interview. No questions, no ledger, no record beyond his own memory of who'd taken from it and when they'd quietly put it back. I met him at Cedar Fork Regional, of all places, 18 years ago. He came in with a laceration from a table saw. I was the nurse who stitched his hand. He asked me to dinner while I still had his blood on my gloves. I told him, at the time, that was either the least romantic or the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me. It turned out, over 18 years, to be both. His mother did not approve. She never said so outright. Not in those exact words, but I learned to read Carol Marsh the way I read a patient who insists they're fine while every vital sign says otherwise. The tightness around her eyes at our wedding, the careful generic toast she gave that never once used my name, the Christmas cards addressed to Thomas and family for the first 3 years of our marriage, as if I hadn't yet earned a noun of my own. Thomas noticed some of this. He apologized for his mother more than once in the early years. Tired, embarrassed. He'd been apologizing for her his whole life and had run out of new words for it. "She'll come around," he used to say. She never did. What she did instead, over 18 years, was arrive at a permanent, comfortable tolerance, the kind that requires no growth and no cost, and mistake it for acceptance. I built a life anyway. I want that understood clearly. This is not a story about a woman who suffered 18 years and finally, at the end, got even. It's a story about a woman who built something real inside a family that never fully welcomed her, and who discovered, at the very end, that the man she built it with had been quietly protecting that life the entire time, in ways she never asked him to and never expected. We had no children of our own. A private grief Thomas and I carried together, rarely discussed outside our own four walls. Nia became, by unspoken agreement, the closest thing to a daughter either of us claimed. Ever since she was small enough to sit on the store's front counter while her mother picked up parts for a leaking faucet. Thomas taught her to change a tire at 11 years old. I taught her to read a blood pressure cuff at 14, mostly as a party trick. She'd since told me she was thinking about nursing school herself. That filled me with a pride I hadn't fully examined until Thomas was gone, and I had more quiet hours than I knew what to do with. Denise, Bradley's ex-wife, had been part of my life longer than her marriage to Bradley had lasted. We'd bonded, back when she was still married to him, over a shared understanding. What it cost to love a Marshman while being treated as provisional family by a Marsh woman. Denise wasn't black. Her exclusion from Carol's inner circle came from a different source, a divorce Carol never forgave her for, regardless of who was at fault. But the shape of being kept at arm's length felt familiar enough between us. We recognized each other instantly. Two women circling the same cold sun from different distances. It was Denise, 3 weeks before the funeral, who first said the word fraud out loud to me. She didn't know yet how precisely accurate she was being. I always thought there was something off with the store's numbers, she told me over coffee at a diner outside town. She chose her words carefully, the way someone does who's learned the hard way what it costs to speculate about that family in public. Bradley used to get real cagey whenever inventory came up. I used to think maybe he was skimming a little. Nothing huge, the way some men do when they feel entitled to a business they never had to build. I didn't think it was worse than that. "Why do you think it might be worse than that now?" I asked. "Because," Denise said, stirring her coffee slowly, "Carol called me last week, asking if I still had copies of any old bank statements from when Bradley and I were married. Joint accounts," she said, "for estate purposes. I don't know why a woman needs 5-year-old bank statements from her son's failed marriage, unless she's trying to account for money that isn't where it's supposed to be." I sat with that information the way I sit with an unexpected lab result, turning it over, checking it against everything else I already knew. Carol was not simply protecting her son. Carol was building a story, quietly, in advance. One she could tell if anyone ever asked hard questions about where $61,000 had actually gone. I didn't tell Denise about the trust. I didn't tell her about the forged signature. I thanked her for the coffee and for her honesty. I drove home, turning one thought over and over, plain and clinical. Carol was not merely certain of a future that was never hers to plan. Carol was frightened of a past she couldn't fully control. Fear, in my experience, both professional and personal, makes people move faster and sloppier than certainty ever does. The dramatic irony of the 2 weeks that followed sat with me constantly, a low hum underneath every ordinary interaction. I sat through a phone call with Carol about flower arrangements. I held in a mental ledger only I could see the knowledge that the arrangements she was fussing over would be paid for, eventually, by an estate she believed was hers and was not. I nodded through a conversation with Bradley about keeping things simple for Mom's sake. I knew his own signature, forged onto his brother's name, was sitting in a folder 2 blocks off Elm Street. Waiting for a Saturday, neither of them had circled on any calendar but their own. I didn't gloat, even privately. I want to be honest about that. Gloating would have made me smaller than the version of myself I was trying to be. For Thomas, for Nia, for the 22 years of my own professional discipline that had taught me the difference between justice and spectacle. I simply watched. The way you watch a chart trending in a direction the patient's family hasn't noticed yet. I waited for the moment when watching would finally give way to action. I called Walter once more that same week, mostly to ask a question that had been sitting with me since the letter. Whether Thomas had ever considered simply confronting Bradley directly, man to man, instead of building all of this machinery around a reveal. He considered it, Walter told me. We discussed it more than once, actually. He worried it would only give Bradley time to hide the trail further, or give Carol time to construct a defense. He also worried, closer to his own words, that a quiet conversation would let both of them keep pretending nothing had happened. Thomas wanted the truth to land where it couldn't be managed or minimized. He wanted witnesses who weren't emotionally invested in protecting anyone's comfort. That sounds like him, I said. He hated when people managed a problem instead of solving it. He mentioned that phrase to me almost verbatim, Walter said, and I could hear, even over the phone, something like fondness in it. He said his mother had spent her whole life managing problems instead of solving them, and he didn't want you inheriting that particular family habit along with everything else. I thought about that conversation for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over the way I turn over most things that matter. Slowly, from more than one angle, until I trust the shape of it. Thomas hadn't simply been protecting me from Carol's cruelty. He'd been protecting the eventual reckoning itself, making sure it happened in a room too public and too documented for anyone to quietly smooth it back into silence. 10 days before the funeral, I drove to the courthouse in Greensboro on my day off. Alone, I pulled the recorded deed to the store's real property. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, in the county's own records, before I trusted anything Walter had told me in that cramped office above the shoe repair shop. The clerk who helped me, a heavy-set woman named Patrice with reading glasses on a beaded chain, pulled the file without comment and slid it across the counter. There it was, in the flat, unglamorous language of public record. A deed of trust recorded 14 months and 6 days earlier, transferring beneficial interest in the Milrose Avenue property into the Thomas Everett Marsh Revocable Trust. Adrian Boykin, Marsh named as successor trustee. Recorded, stamped, timed, dated. Sitting in a public file cabinet in Guilford County the entire time, Carol Marsh had been telling church ladies about a simple, uncontested inheritance. I stood at that counter for a long moment, reading my own name in a county record. Patrice, without asking why, slid a box of tissues 2 inches closer to my side of the counter. The quiet courtesy of a woman who'd clearly seen this particular kind of moment before. "You all right, honey?" she asked. "I will be," I said. I meant it, in a way I hadn't quite been able to mean it since the morning Thomas died. I drove home from Greensboro that afternoon with the certified copy of the deed folded flat in my glove box. I made a decision I hadn't fully planned to make. I called Walter and asked him to come to the house instead. I wanted to walk him through everything Thomas had left behind, room by room. The way you'd walk a new attending through a patient's full history rather than a single chart note. He came that evening, still in his gray suit. He sat at our kitchen table while I pulled out the folder Thomas had left in his desk drawer. The ordinary manila one nobody else had ever thought to look inside. It sat, unremarkably, beside 3 years of tax returns. Inside it, along with a copy of the trust Walter already had, was something I hadn't shown anyone yet. A single handwritten page in Thomas's block print, dated 8 months before he died, addressed simply, "For Addie, when the time comes." I read it out loud to Walter that night. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and Mom's already decided how things are supposed to go," it began. "She's going to tell you the store's worth 40, maybe 50,000 once the dust settles. It's worth a lot more than that, Addie, and she knows it. She's the one who had it appraised 3 years ago when she first started thinking about what happens after I'm not around to argue with her. I found the appraisal in her files by accident. $712,000, land and inventory and accounts together. She's been sitting on that number for 3 years, hoping nobody else ever finds it. Now you have." I stopped reading for a moment. Walter didn't say anything. He let the silence hold the way he seemed to let most important things hold, until they'd finished saying what they needed to say. "There's more," I told him, and kept reading. "About Bradley," the letter continued. "I never told you the whole truth about that credit line. I didn't want you carrying it before you had to. It wasn't just one bad signature. He's been quietly moving small amounts out of the store's account for almost 3 years. A few hundred here, a few hundred there. Never enough at once to trip an alarm. But enough, added up, to explain where a good chunk of that 61,000 actually went. Mom knows. She's known for 6 months. She's not protecting Bradley because she loves him more than she loves the truth, Addie. She's protecting Bradley because if the truth comes out, everyone will ask how she didn't notice for 3 years. And the answer is that she was too busy deciding you weren't real family to look closely at the one who actually was stealing from her. I set the letter down on the table and looked at Walter for a long moment. "She's known for 6 months," I said. "That matches something I'd suspected," Walter said quietly. "The timeline on when she started inquiring about selling the property. 6 months ago. I'd wondered what triggered it. Now we know." This changed something in me, reading that letter. More than the trust itself had. More than the deed at the courthouse had. It wasn't simply that Carol had dismissed me for 18 years because of the color of my skin, though she had, plainly and repeatedly, in 100 small currencies I'd spent 2 decades cataloging. It was that her dismissal of me had cost her the one thing her contempt should have made easier to see. She'd been so certain I didn't belong in that family's inner circle. She'd never once considered I might be the only person paying close enough attention to notice what her own favored son was doing to the business right under her nose. Walter and I sat with that letter a while longer. The kitchen was quiet around us. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked at nothing in particular. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want an honest answer, not a lawyer's answer." "I'll try," Walter said. "Do you think Thomas forgave his mother? Before he died. For all of it. The 18 years. Walter considered the question with the same careful attention he gave everything, turning it over before he spoke. I think Thomas made peace with who she was. He said finally, I don't think that's quite the same as forgiveness. He told me once that forgiving somebody who's never once acknowledged the wrong felt like signing a contract nobody else had read. He said he'd rather build something true. Let the truth do whatever forgiving needed doing, in its own time, if it ever came. I sat with that answer for a long moment. It sounded exactly like him, precise and a little stubborn and quietly generous all at once. That's a very Thomas answer, I said. He was a very particular kind of man, Walter agreed. I've represented a great many clients in 30 years of this work, Mrs. Marsh. Few of them thought as far ahead or as carefully about the people they'd be leaving behind. I told Nia some of this, carefully, a version scrubbed of dollar figures and legal specifics because she was 17 and this wasn't hers to carry in full. But she deserved to understand the shape of what was coming. So Uncle Bradley's actually in trouble, she said. Like real trouble. Like real trouble, I confirmed. And Grandma Carol knew and didn't say anything. She had her reasons. Not good ones, but reasons. Nia was quiet for a moment, turning something over. The way 17-year-olds do when they're testing a thought before trusting it out loud. Uncle Thomas knew you'd figure it out. That's why he left it all with you instead of just, like, telling you straight out while he was still here. I thought about that longer than I let on. I think he wanted me to find my own way to it, I said finally. Not because he doubted me, because he knew I'd trust it more if I built the picture myself, instead of just being handed the ending. That's very you, Nia said. Very chart it, don't argue it of him. I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in what felt like a very long 2 weeks. She wasn't wrong. Thomas had married a woman who processed grief the way she processed everything else. Methodically, patiently, one confirmed data point at a time. He'd built his entire final gift to her around that exact habit of mind. Nia stayed for supper that night. The two of us ate leftovers standing up at the kitchen counter, the way we'd fallen into doing since Thomas died. Neither of us was quite ready to sit at a table built for two and set for one. She asked me, carefully, whether I was scared of what was coming. A little, I admitted. Not of losing. I know how this ends, or close to it. I'm scared of the version of me that has to stand in that room and watch it happen. What version is that? The version that doesn't get to be just a widow that day, I said. The version that has to be a trustee and a witness, and the only person in the room who already knows the ending. That's a lot of hats for one afternoon. You've worn worse hats, Nia said, which was such a strange, specific teenage way to put it, that I laughed again, twice in one evening, which felt like more grace than I'd allowed myself in weeks. I thought about that conversation more than once in the days that followed. Nia was right, in her blunt 17-year-old way. I had worn worse hats, 18 years of them. This one, at least, came with an ending I already knew the shape of. That same week, I drove 2 counties over to Mount Zion AME, the church I'd grown up in, the one Carol had never once set foot inside in 18 years, despite 3 separate invitations to Easter service. My mother was long gone by then, but the choir loft still held the particular hush of a place that shaped me before anyone in the Marsh family ever met me. I sat in a back pew on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sanctuary was empty except for Pastor Odell doing paperwork in his office. He came out when he heard the door. An older man now, slower than he'd been when he baptized me at 11 years old. He sat beside me without asking why I'd come. You carrying something heavy, he said. It wasn't a question either. I found out something about Thomas's family, I said. Something that's going to come out soon. in a way that's going to hurt some people who've spent a long time not seeing me clearly. You feel bad about that? A little, I admitted. Mostly I feel tired. 18 years of tired, if I'm honest. Pastor Odell nodded slowly, the particular nod of a man who's heard a version of that sentence from 100 different pews over 40 years of ministry. Your grandmother used to sit right about where you're sitting now, he said. Woman never raised her voice a day in her life. Everybody in 3 counties knew better than to try her patience twice. She used to say, the Lord doesn't need you loud, he needs you accurate. Loud gets attention, accurate gets justice. I chart it. I don't argue it, I said, half to myself. Same idea, Pastor Odell said, smiling for the first time since he'd sat down. Different uniform. I sat with him another 20 minutes, not saying much else, letting the quiet of that sanctuary do the work my own thoughts hadn't managed to do alone. I left feeling steadier than I had going in, the way you always feel steadier leaving a room built specifically to hold the weight you walked in carrying. I stopped by Marcus's house on my way home that evening. Unplanned. I passed his street, and something in me wanted one more steady voice before the week ahead. He was out front trimming a hedge that didn't need trimming, the way men of a certain generation manage anxiety with yard work instead of words. You look like a woman carrying something, he said, not looking up from the hedge. I am, I said. I can't tell you what yet. Soon, though. Thomas trusted you with something, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. I could tell, this last year. He started looking at you different, not less loving. More like a man checking his own work before he hands it off. I hadn't thought of it in exactly those words before, but they fit. You're not wrong, I said. I've worked for that family 35 years, Marcus said, finally setting down his shears. Watched a lot of people underestimate a lot of other people in that store. Never once saw it end well for the ones doing the underestimating. Whatever's coming, Adrian, I trust you to handle it the right way. Thomas would have trusted the same. I thanked him, and I meant it more than the moment probably showed, and I drove the rest of the way home, turning his words over. The particular relief of being seen clearly by someone who'd earned the right to see you that way. The last dinner before the funeral happened at Carol's house again, 4 days out, ostensibly to finalize logistics for the service. Though I'd come to understand by then that every gathering Carol called was really an audience she was building for whatever announcement she intended to make next. Bradley barely spoke through the meal. Carol talked enough for both of them. Flower arrangements, pallbearer assignments, the exact wording she wanted on the programs. Occasionally a line about once we get past all this and get back to normal, which she seemed to think sounded compassionate rather than impatient. At one point, apropos of nothing, she turned to me and said, I do hope you're not planning anything unusual for the service, Adrian. Thomas would have wanted things done properly, traditionally. I know your side of the family does things a little differently, and that's fine, of course. But I think for Thomas's sake, we should keep things simple. I let that sit in the air exactly as long as it needed to sit. The way I let a difficult vital sign sit on a monitor before I decide whether it's a trend or a blip. I think Thomas would have wanted things done honestly, I said. That's the only tradition I'm planning on keeping. Carol smiled, the particular smile of a woman who hears agreement in every sentence regardless of what was actually said. Exactly. Honestly and simply, I'm so glad we agree. Later in that same dinner, Carol brought up the reception itself. She laid out her plans with the meticulous pride of an event planner rather than a grieving mother. I've ordered champagne, she announced. Real champagne, not the sparkling nonsense. I think it's important we mark this properly. Close one chapter and open the next, as a family, in front of everyone who's known us. I've had napkins printed even, new beginnings, in gold. You've had napkins printed, I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly even. Is that too much? Carol asked, in the tone of a woman who'd already decided the answer was no, regardless of what anyone said back. I just think, after everything, we deserve a moment that looks forward instead of back. Thomas would understand that. He always wanted this family whole. I'm sure he had very specific ideas about what whole was supposed to look like, I said, and reached for the green beans and let the sentence sit exactly where I'd placed it. Bradley, across the table, had gone quiet in a different way than his usual mealtime silence, a stillness that reminded me of patience right before a difficult conversation they know is coming and can't stop. He excused himself twice during dinner, once to take a call he didn't explain, once to stand at the back door staring out at Carol's dark yard. When he came back the second time, his hands weren't quite steady around his water glass. "You all right, Bradley?" I asked, not unkindly, genuinely curious what version of the truth he might offer, given a small, private opening. "Fine," he said, too fast. The practiced fine of a man who said the word so many times, it no longer means anything, not even to himself. "Just tired. It's been a hard couple months." "It has," I agreed, and let it go. Pressing him further that night would have served nothing except my own curiosity. Curiosity wasn't what I was there to satisfy anymore. Bradley looked up at me across the table for just a moment. Something flickered behind his eyes. Suspicion, maybe, or just the exhaustion of a man running out of road. Then he looked back down at his plate and said nothing at all. I drove home that night past the store. Dark now, except for the single security light Thomas always left burning over the register. I sat in my car across the street for a few minutes, the way I had the morning I couldn't bring myself to go inside. This time, I did go in. I unlocked the front door with my own key, the one Thomas had given me the first month we were married. I stood in the quiet, familiar smell of that place. Motor oil and sawdust, and 40 years of ordinary commerce. I said out loud, "To nobody, Saturday, Thomas. It's almost Saturday." I locked the door behind me when I left. For the first time since he died, the silence didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a held breath, waiting for exactly the right moment to let go. Nia came by the house that final morning before the funeral, early, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line behind the house. She'd brought coffee for both of us. She sat with me at the kitchen table without saying much. The two of us watched the light change through the window over the sink. "You ready?" she finally asked. "As ready as a person gets for something like this," I said. I keep running the day in my head, every version of it. There's no version where it isn't hard. There's only a version where it's hard and true, and a version where it stays hard and stays hidden. I'll take hard and true. "That's a very you answer," Nia said, smiling despite herself. "I've had a lot of practice being very me," I said, and we sat a while longer, finishing our coffee, saying nothing else that needed saying. The particular comfort of two people who trust each other enough to share silence instead of filling it. Walter called one final time that morning, just to confirm the timing. His voice was calm and steady, the way it had been every time I'd heard it since that first Thursday in his office. "Everything's in place," he said. "The program, the timing, my presence at the reception. All that's left is the day itself." "Thank you," I said, "for all of it, for believing him, for being the kind of man who keeps a promise to somebody who isn't around anymore to check on whether you kept it." He was a good client, Walter said, and there was something almost tender in how simply he said it. Better than good. A man who thought about the people he loved even when thinking about them cost him something. That's rarer than you'd think. in my line of work. I held on to that sentence for the rest of the morning, through the drive to the church, through the moment Nia's hand found mine at the side door, through the first sight of Carol's face turning toward me in that second pew. The morning of the funeral, Cedar Fork looked exactly the way it looks every June. Thick heat sitting low over Milrose Avenue. The hardware store's front window carried a hand-lettered sign that read, "Closed for a family loss." The paint on the letters wasn't quite dry when somebody taped it up 2 days earlier. I stood across the street from that store before the service, in my black dress. I thought about how many mornings I'd watched Thomas unlock that door at 5 sharp, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, whistling something tuneless under his breath because he genuinely loved that unglamorous building more than he loved most things. I didn't go inside that morning. I'd already said what I needed to say to it the night before. Some doors you only need to open once before a day like that. Overlook Baptist Fellowship Hall filled up fast. Cedar Fork turns out for funerals the way some towns turn out for football. Thomas had been well liked in the plain, unremarkable way of a man who fixed things for people and never sent a bill that matched the labor. I recognized half the pews, customers, neighbors. A woman whose porch step Thomas had rebuilt for free the year her husband left her with 3 kids and a leaking roof, standing near the back with her grown children beside her. All of them dressed in their good clothes for a man who'd asked for nothing in return for what he'd given her family. Carol sat in the front row in a black suit clearly tailored for the occasion. Bradley beside her. Bradley's 2 teenage children beside him. A row that had already decided, before a single hymn was sung, exactly who belonged in it. I came in through the side door a few minutes before the service began. Nia beside me, her hand already finding mine before we'd even crossed the threshold. That was when Carol turned. She saw me approaching the second pew, where I'd assumed, reasonably, that a widow of 18 years might sit. She said the sentence I opened this whole story with. "There's no seat for you up front, Adrienne. This row's for family." She said it loud enough that the organist's hands paused over the keys for half a beat. Loud enough that Nia flinched beside me, a small physical jolt like she'd touched something hot. Loud enough that 3 or 4 people near the front turned their heads and then turned them away again, fast. The particular cowardice of people who see something wrong happen and decide the kindest thing they can do is pretend they didn't. I did not answer her. I stepped back 1 row. I sat down beside my husband's casket instead of beside his family. I folded my hands in my lap the way my mother taught me to do in church when I was 8 years old and furious about something I wasn't allowed to say out loud yet. The service itself I remember in pieces, the way you remember any funeral for someone you actually loved. More sensation than sequence. The pastor's voice, steady and warm. The kind of voice that said the same true things over 100 caskets and still means every one of them. The particular gray of the June light through the fellowship hall's tall windows. Someone's cousin singing "It Is Well," slightly flat on the high notes. Nobody minding, because grief doesn't grate on pitch. The pastor spoke plainly about Thomas, the way small-town pastors do when they've genuinely known a man, not simply improvising from a card. He talked about Thomas's father before him, about the store's long history on Milrose Avenue, about a family that had, in the pastor's careful words, weathered its share of private storms, the way every family does, and found its own way through. I noticed Carol nodding along at that particular line, as if it referred to something entirely different than what the rest of us in that room were quietly living inside. He read a passage about a house built on rock rather than sand, the kind of scripture chosen for its double meaning in a town full of people who understood exactly what he was pointing toward without him having to point too hard. I watched Bradley shift in his seat during that reading, uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the wooden pews. The eulogy came from Marcus, of all people, not from anyone in Thomas's own family. Carol had asked the pastor to say a few words, standard and generic. But it was Marcus who stood at the podium afterward, uninvited by the program but welcomed anyway, by a room that clearly understood he'd earned the right. He told the story of a boy who started sweeping that store's floors at 9 years old for 50 cents an afternoon. A boy who never once, in 35 years, stopped treating the people who walked through its door like they mattered more than whatever they were buying. Thomas Marsh extended credit to half this county at one point or another, Marcus said, his voice thick but steady. Never once made a man feel small for needing it. Never once brought it up again after it was paid back. I worked beside him for 15 years, and I can tell you the realest thing I know about him. He judged people by what they did, not by what they looked like, or where they came from, or who their people were. I wish more of the people in this room had learned that from him while he was still here to teach it. I watched Carol's face during that eulogy. I saw something flicker there I couldn't quite name yet. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to the discomfort of a person hearing their own child praised for a value they suspected, somewhere private, they'd never fully modeled themselves. I remember Nia's hand tightening in mine during the second hymn. She was 17. She was furious on my behalf, in a way I'd trained myself, over 2 decades, not to let myself feel in public anymore. "That was wrong," she whispered. "What she said. That was wrong." "I know," I whispered back. "Write it down somewhere, baby. Not for me, for you. So you remember exactly how it felt. So you never do it to anybody." I did not cry until the casket was lowered. I'd promised myself I wouldn't. Not in front of that family, not where Carol could file it away as evidence of something fragile in me she could use later. But when the mechanism lowered him into the ground, slow and mechanical and final in a way no amount of nursing experience prepares you for when it's your own husband, I let it come. Quiet, controlled. My hand pressed flat against my sternum, the way I press a hand against a patient's chest when I need to feel that a heart is still doing its work. Walter Ferris stood at the very back of the crowd during the burial. Gray suit, leather folder tucked under one arm. Nobody looked at him twice. Nobody wondered who he was. In a town like Cedar Fork, a stranger in a gray suit at a funeral reads as insurance, or a distant cousin, or somebody's accountant. People are too polite or too incurious to ask. He caught my eye once across the open grave and gave the smallest possible nod. Not sympathy, confirmation. The kind of look you exchange with a coworker right before a shift change, when you both already know what's coming and neither of you needs to say it out loud. Denise found me near the cars afterward, dressed in gray, standing a respectful distance from the immediate family, the way she'd learned to over the years. "You holding up?" she asked. "I will be," I said. The same answer I'd given Patrice at the courthouse. I meant it the same way. "Carol's already talking about the toast," Denise said quietly, glancing back toward where Carol stood accepting condolences like a woman collecting dues. She told the pastor's wife she has an announcement. I don't know what that woman thinks she's announcing, but I'd bet money it's going to make my skin crawl. "Probably," I agreed. "You don't seem worried," Denise said, studying my face for a moment. "I'm not," I said, and left it there. Some things are better shown than told. The fellowship hall's larger room was already being set up for exactly that. 20 minutes and a short drive away. The reception room, used the rest of the year for potlucks and vacation Bible school registration, had been transformed as much as a room full of folding tables can be transformed. The church's care committee had laid out casserole dishes and sweet tea before the burial had even finished. Chicken and rice and green bean casserole, thick and comforting in a way that felt almost cruel against what I knew was coming. Carol had added her own touch. A table near the front held actual champagne, real glass flutes, borrowed from somewhere. A small stack of cocktail napkins printed absurdly, with gold script reading, New Beginnings. She must have ordered them weeks in advance. Back when she was already so certain of an outcome, she'd never once verified that she was willing to put money behind the stationery. I stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. I felt Nia's hand find mine again. "You okay?" she asked. "I am," I said. "Stay close. But let this happen the way it's going to happen. You don't need to say anything. Nobody does, except Walter, when it's time." "Is it time soon?" "Soon," I said. I had the funeral program folded once in my jacket pocket. The paper had gone soft at the crease from how many times I'd touched it that morning without meaning to. Behind the printed order of service, stapled flat against the inside fold where nobody would think to look unless they were told to, was a single typed page. Walter had prepared it at my request 3 days earlier. A summary. 6 sentences. The kind of document that means nothing to a stranger, and everything to the one person in the room who understands what it is. Thomas's line came back to me as I smoothed the program flat in my pocket. Read what's stapled behind it. I'd spent 6 weeks not fully understanding what he meant. I understood it now, standing in a doorway, watching Carol Marsh direct the placement of champagne flutes on a folding table, like a woman arranging her own coronation. The room filled slowly at first. Mourners drifted in from the burial in 2s and 3s, plates already loaded with casserole, voices dropping into the low, comfortable murmur of people who've done their crying already and are ready, cautiously, to remember a life instead of just grieve its end. I recognized faces from 20 years of holidays and hardware runs. The porch step widow, a retired teacher who'd once tutored Bradley through algebra and still, apparently, checked in on him. Marcus, standing near the food table, watching the room the way I imagine he'd watched that store for 15 years. Quietly, thoroughly, missing nothing. I thought, standing there, about how many rooms like this one I'd stood in over 18 years. Always slightly apart, always polite, always careful. This would be the last one where that particular version of careful was required of me, though I didn't yet know exactly how it would end. Only that an ending was coming, built by a man who'd loved me enough to make sure I wouldn't have to build it myself from nothing. Bradley was already at the bar table when I walked in, pouring himself a glass before anyone else had one, his hand not quite steady on the bottle. I watched him drink half of it in one motion, the particular thirst of a man trying to get ahead of a feeling before it catches him. He caught my eye once across the room and looked away fast, the way a person looks away from a light that's too bright to hold. Denise found her way to a spot near the back of the room, close enough to see everything, far enough to stay out of whatever was coming. Marcus caught my eye from across the room and gave a small nod, the same steady nod he'd given me over that hedge 2 nights earlier. He didn't know exactly what was coming either, not the specifics, but he seemed to sense the shape of it, the way a man who's watched a business for 35 years can sense weather before it arrives. The porch step widow's family drifted past me on their way to the food table, and the widow herself paused long enough to squeeze my hand once, wordless. The particular solidarity of people who've both been quietly underestimated by the same small-town machinery at different points in their lives. I appreciated it more than I let my face show. I checked the time on my phone, tucked half hidden in my jacket pocket. nearly 3 o'clock. Carol had told the church ladies she wanted to make her announcement before the good casserole ran out, which struck me, standing there, as exactly the kind of detail that would end up in this story. One more small absurdity layered onto a day that was about to become anything but small. Emma found me near the drinks table, still in her funeral dress, looking older than 14 in the particular way children do at events built around loss. "My dad keeps going to the bathroom," she said quietly, "like a lot. I think he's throwing up. I don't know if I should tell someone." "I'll keep an eye on him," I told her, crouching slightly to meet her at eye level again, the same way I had in Carol's hallway 2 nights earlier. "You don't have to carry that today, sweetheart. Go find your cousins. Eat some of that casserole your grandmother's so worried about." Emma nodded and drifted off toward the food table, and I watched Bradley emerge from the hallway a moment later, pale and unsteady, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand before catching himself and straightening his tie, performing composure for a room that hadn't yet earned the right to see him fall apart. I thought, watching him, about something Thomas's letter had said, about mercy running out rather than being taken. Bradley had spent 18 months with a mercy he never knew he'd been given. A brother who found the forgery and chose silence instead of exposure. It struck me, standing in that doorway, that Bradley's unraveling had actually started long before this afternoon. It started the day he signed a name that wasn't his, and convinced himself the ground beneath it would hold indefinitely. Naya appeared at my elbow again, glancing toward Bradley, then back at me. "He looks like he already knows," she whispered. "Some part of him probably does," I said. "People usually know, underneath, long before the proof arrives to make them admit it. That's true for the guilty and the wronged both, in my experience. The body knows before the mind's ready to." Nia considered that, turning it over the careful way she'd started to, a habit she'd clearly absorbed from watching me these last several weeks. "Is that a nursing thing or an Adrian thing?" "Both, probably," I said. 22 years blurs the line eventually. Nia stood beside me near the doorway, close enough that I could feel her breathing shift, when Carol tapped a spoon against her champagne glass and the whole room turned toward her at once. Walter caught my eye across the room one last time before Carol began. A small, steady look that asked nothing and confirmed everything. The particular communication of two people who have already agreed on how the next several minutes need to unfold. I gave him the smallest possible nod back, the same gesture he'd given me across Thomas's open grave that morning. I felt the last of my nerves settle into something calmer and more certain. I thought, in that final quiet moment before Carol's spoon found her glass, about all the rooms in this family where I had stood exactly like this, watching, waiting, absorbing whatever the room decided to hand me. Raising my voice had never once, in 18 years, changed the outcome of anything. This would be different. Not because I intended to raise my voice now, because for the first time, the outcome had already been decided by someone who'd loved me enough to make sure it would be. "If everyone could gather round," Carol said, her voice carrying easily across the fellowship hall, "I'd like to say a few words." I felt the room shift toward her. The particular gravity a woman like Carol had spent 74 years learning how to generate. I stayed where I was, near the doorway, my hand resting lightly on the folded program in my jacket pocket. I waited. Walter Ferris had positioned himself against the far wall 10 minutes earlier, leather folder still tucked under his arm, exactly where he'd need to be when the moment came. Nobody in that room had asked him a single question all day. That was, I understood now, precisely the point of a gray suit and an unhurried manner. People see what they expect to see. Nobody expected anything from the quiet man by the wall. Thomas was a wonderful son, Carol began. Her voice was already thick with the performance of grief rather than the substance of it, a distinction I'd learned to hear clearly over 18 years. He built something real in this town, something his father started and he carried forward with his whole heart. I know today has been hard for all of us, but I also believe Thomas would want us thinking ahead, as a family, about how we move forward from here. A few heads nodded around the room, the reflexive agreement people offer a grieving mother, regardless of what she actually says next. Carol seemed to draw confidence from it, straightening slightly. The posture of a woman who has just confirmed her audience is exactly where she wants them. She paused. She took a small sip of champagne. She looked directly at me across the room. "I've spoken with our attorney," Carol continued, "and once the estate settles, which shouldn't take more than a few weeks given how simple everything is, the store and the house will transfer properly into the family's hands." I know that might be hard to hear today, Adrienne, but I think we all understand that's how Thomas would have wanted it. Family holds on to what family built. A murmur moved through the room. The low, uncomfortable sound of people who sense something is being said that shouldn't be said in public, and say nothing anyway. I did not answer her yet. I let the silence hold a beat longer than was comfortable, the way I'd learned to do with a difficult patient's family, giving a false statement just enough room to keep talking until it talked itself into a corner. The porch step widow, standing near the casserole table, exchanged a look with her grown daughter, the particular look of people who've just watched something they can't quite name happen in front of them. A few church ladies near the champagne table glanced at each other, then at me, then quickly back at Carol, the reflexive politeness of people trained since childhood not to interrupt a grieving mother, even one saying something that plainly deserved interrupting. Bradley set his empty glass down harder than he meant to. The sound cracked against the folding table. Nobody but me seemed to notice how pale he'd gone. Carol didn't stop there. She rarely stopped at the first cruelty when a second one was standing right behind it. She glanced toward Bradley, some flicker of maternal instinct briefly surfacing beneath the performance before continuing. "I do want to say," Carol went on, warming now, sensing no resistance, "that Thomas gave this family 18 good years of trying to make an unconventional marriage work, and I respected him for his patience. I did. But I think it's time, now that he's gone, for things to go back to how they were always meant to be. This has always been a Marsh family business, on Marsh family land, and it should stay that way." I watched several faces in the crowd shift almost imperceptibly at that phrase, unconventional marriage. The particular discomfort of people recognizing a cruelty dressed up as sentiment. Too polite or too accustomed to Carol's ways to name it out loud. Marcus, near the food table, had gone very still, the stillness of a man deciding whether 35 years of employment gave him standing to say something he clearly wanted to say. She lifted her glass higher. "To new beginnings," Carol said, and smiled at me the way she'd smiled at me for 18 years. Warm on the surface, cold underneath. Certain of an outcome she'd never once bothered to verify. "This house is ours now, Adrienne. You were never really family. I think we can all finally say that out loud." A few glasses rose around the room, uncertain, following her lead, the way people follow a strong current even when they suspect it's pulling toward rocks. Nia did not raise hers. Denise, standing near the back, set hers down entirely and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as bracing for something. I set my own glass of lemonade down on the nearest table. Slow and deliberate. No sound at all. I want to tell you what those few seconds felt like, standing there, because I think they matter more than almost anything else in this story. I had spent 18 years learning to make myself smaller in rooms exactly like this one. Smaller at the dinner table, smaller in the seating chart, smaller in the pause after a cruel joke when laughing along cost less than objecting. I had gotten very good at making myself smaller. It had felt most days like survival rather than surrender, and maybe it was both at once. Standing in that doorway, glass set down, program still folded in my pocket, I felt something entirely different moving through me. Not rage, not triumph, not yet, something closer to arrival. The particular quiet sensation of a woman who has spent 2 decades being told she doesn't belong in a room, finally understanding that the room itself was about to belong to her instead, recorded and notarized and true. Whether anyone standing in it that afternoon had bothered to notice or not. I thought of Thomas briefly, the way you think of someone in the half second before something enormous happens. A flash of his face across a hospital bed in his last week, asking me quietly whether I trusted him. I had said yes without hesitation, the way you say yes to a man who has never once given you a reason to say otherwise. Standing in that fellowship hall, watching Carol's champagne catch the afternoon light, I understood exactly what that trust had been building toward the whole time. The room hadn't gone silent yet. Somewhere near the casserole table, a fork scraped a plate. Somewhere behind me, one of the church ladies murmured something to another, still oblivious to what the next few minutes held. Carol's smile was still fixed in place, still certain, still entirely unaware that the ground beneath her version of this story had already shifted 14 months earlier. In a cramped office above a shoe repair shop on Elm Street, it had simply been waiting, patiently, for exactly this Saturday to make itself known. Then I turned toward the back of the room, where a man in a gray suit had been standing quietly against the wall for the last 20 minutes, and I nodded. Walter Ferris cleared his throat. It was not a loud sound. It was the small, polite, unmistakable sound of a man about to speak in a room that hadn't yet noticed him. It landed in that fellowship hall like a struck bell. Heads turned. Carol's smile held for one more second, then began, almost imperceptibly, to falter. The particular falter of a woman realizing a variable has entered her equation that she never accounted for. "I'm sorry," Carol said, an edge creeping into her voice for the first time all afternoon. "Who exactly are you?" "My name is Walter Ferris," he said, stepping forward, opening the leather folder he'd carried under his arm through an entire funeral and burial, without a single person asking what was inside it. "I'm an estate attorney and notary, retained 14 months ago by Thomas Marsh. Mrs. Marsh asked me to be here today." "Retained for what?" Carol said. I watched her eyes flick toward me. Some old, buried instinct finally, too late, beginning to sound an alarm. "For this," Walter said, and set a single document down on the same folding table that held the half-empty champagne bottle. Squarely in the middle of the room, in front of everyone who just raised a glass to a future that had never actually been theirs to toast. "This is the Thomas Everett Marsh Revocable Trust," Walter said. His voice was even and unhurried. The voice of a man reading test results he already knows the answer to. "Executed 14 months ago. Witnessed and notarized in my office. Recorded at the Guilford County Register of Deeds 14 months and 6 days ago." I'll read the operative clause if I may. Nobody said he couldn't. Nobody in that room, in that moment, seemed capable of saying anything at all. I, Thomas Everett Marsh, being of sound mind, Hereby transfer all right, title, and interest in the property known as Marsh Hardware on Milrose Avenue, the residence at 214 Milrose, and all accounts held in my name, to the Thomas Everett Marsh Revocable Trust, naming my wife, Adrienne Boykin Marsh, as sole trustee and sole beneficiary, effective immediately upon my death. The room did not gasp exactly. It did something quieter and worse for Carol, a kind of collective stillness. 30 people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about the last hour. Carol's face drained. I watched it happen the way I've watched color leave a patient's face during a genuine medical event. All at once, evenly, starting at the cheeks and moving outward. Her lips going pale, then her ears, until she looked less like a woman who'd been embarrassed and more like a woman whose whole circulatory system had briefly forgotten its job. "That's not possible," Carol said, her voice thin now, stripped of the warm certainty it had carried all afternoon. "Thomas would have told me. There's no way he'd have done something like this without telling his own mother. He told me," Walter said simply. "He came to my office 14 months ago because he'd found something in the store's financial records that concerned him. A signature on a $61,000 line of credit that was not his own, despite bearing his name." Bradley's glass hit the floor. It didn't shatter. It just rolled once and settled against a table leg. But the sound of it, small as it was, seemed to fill the entire room. "He knew," Bradley said so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "He knew, and he never said anything." "He knew," Walter confirmed, turning to face Bradley directly for the first time. "He confirmed it wasn't his signature on March 14th of last year. He documented it. He chose not to confront you directly, Mr. Marsh, because he wanted the truth to surface on its own timeline, in its own way, rather than force a family confrontation while he still had time left to enjoy what remained of it." "This is absurd," Carol said, her voice climbing now, the first real crack in 18 years of composed, weaponized warmth. "Bradley wouldn't forge anything. This is clearly some kind of manipulation, some scheme Adrienne cooked up to steal what belongs to this family." "Mrs. Marsh," Walter said, something in his tone, still even, still unhurried, carried an authority that made even Carol pause. "The deed is recorded. The trust is notarized and witnessed. I have no financial interest in this outcome beyond fulfilling the wishes of a client who is, unfortunately, no longer here to speak for himself. I'd also note for the record that you contacted a title company 6 months ago, inquiring about a potential sale of this same property, despite having no legal title to convey. That inquiry is a matter I intend to disclose to the appropriate parties. Given what we now understand about the timeline of your knowledge," Carol opened her mouth and then closed it again. The sound of a woman who'd spent her entire adult life controlling every room she entered, suddenly finding herself with nothing true left to say in this one. I stepped forward then, for the first time since the toast had begun. The room's attention swung toward me the way it hadn't in 18 years of gatherings in that family. Not because I raised my voice, because for the first time, everyone in that room understood I was the one holding the actual answer. "I'd like to say something," I said quietly, and the room went even stiller than it had been for Walter. "Carol said, a few minutes ago, that I was never really family. I've heard some version of that sentence for 18 years, in 100 different rooms, said 100 different ways. I never argued it. I just kept showing up. I kept paying attention. I kept a chart, the way I've been trained to for 22 years, of every single thing that actually happened in this family, regardless of what anyone wanted to be true instead." I looked at Carol directly. I kept my voice level, the way I keep it with a family member who needs to hear something hard delivered without cruelty. Thomas knew exactly who I was to him, I said. He built this. I gestured once, simply, toward the document on the table, specifically because he understood, better than anyone else in this room, what it meant that his own mother spent 18 years deciding I didn't belong, while his own brother spent 3 years quietly taking from the business she was so certain belonged to the family and not to me. Nobody spoke. Nia's hand found mine again, steady, and I held it. I'm not interested in punishing anyone beyond what the law and the truth require, I said, but I am done being told what I am and am not in a family I gave 18 years of my life to. That's over as of today, not because I'm angry, because it's simply, finally, no longer true. Carol sat down. I don't think she chose to, exactly. Her legs made the decision for her, folding into the nearest folding chair the way a marionette folds when somebody finally lets go of the strings. She stared at the document on the table, like it might rearrange itself back into the story she'd been telling herself for months. It didn't. Paper doesn't do that, no matter how badly a person needs it to. Bradley hadn't moved from where he stood by the champagne table. His face had gone through several colors in a few minutes. Red, then gray, then something closer to the pale of old candle wax. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard from him in 18 years of holidays and dinners. I can explain, he said, to the room in general, to nobody specific. The universal opening line of a man who's never once had a good explanation ready when he needed it. It wasn't. It started small. I was going to pay it back. Mr. Marsh, Walter said, not unkindly, I'd strongly encourage you to say nothing further without counsel present. This conversation is already going to be relevant to a fraud referral I intend to file with First Piedmont Trust on Mrs. Marsh's behalf in her capacity as trustee, given that the credit line in question was secured against trust property using a forged signature. A fraud referral, Carol repeated. The words landed on her like a second, smaller collapse, layered on top of the first. Bradley, tell me that's not true. Tell this man that's not true. Bradley didn't answer her. He looked instead at the floor, at his own shoes, at anything that wasn't his mother's face, demanding a denial he no longer had the strength to construct. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence I'd sat through in that family in 18 years. For once, I let it hold without filling it, without softening it, without doing the emotional labor of managing everyone else's discomfort the way I'd been trained, by that very family, to do instinctively for 2 decades. Denise was the one who finally moved. She crossed the room to stand beside me, not saying anything, just present, the way she'd been present in small, steady ways since long before any of this began. "You want to sit down?" she asked quietly. "Not yet," I said. "I want to see this all the way through standing up." Walter closed his leather folder. He looked around the room once, taking in the 30-some faces still frozen in various stages of shock, the abandoned champagne glasses, the cocktail napkins printed with a phrase that had, in the space of 10 minutes, become something closer to a punchline than a promise. "There's a formal process ahead," he said, addressing the room generally now, his voice carrying the same even authority it had all afternoon. "Probate will confirm the trust, which given its proper execution and recording should move quickly. The credit line matter will go through the bank's fraud review separately. None of that needs to happen in this room today. I only came to make sure the facts were established clearly, in front of the people who needed to hear them clearly, before any further transactions were attempted based on a misunderstanding of what actually belongs to whom." "A misunderstanding," Carol said, some of her old sharpness trying, weakly, to resurface. Is that what we're calling this? I'd call it a costly one, Walter said, for reasons that have very little to do with Mrs. Marsh. I want to walk you through what happened over the weeks that followed. The aftermath of a moment like that is rarely as tidy as the moment itself. I think the truth of how justice actually moves, slow and procedural and unglamorous, matters as much as the drama of the reveal. Probate confirmed the trust within 3 weeks, faster than Walter had even predicted, in part because the paperwork had been so meticulously prepared 14 months earlier by a man who'd known exactly how much time he might not have to correct any errors later. The county recorder's office updated the file. The deed I'd already seen with my own eyes at that courthouse counter became, officially, uncontested. $712,000 in real estate, inventory, and accounts. All of it now mine to steward the way Thomas had trusted me to. Bradley's fraud referral moved slower, the way these things do. First, Piedmont Trust's internal review took just over a month. Bradley retained a lawyer of his own, a young man from Greensboro who advised him, apparently, to cooperate fully rather than contest what the bank's own signature analysts confirmed within days. The application bore Thomas's name, but not his hand. The $61,000 debt, once the bank completed its review, transferred fully to Bradley personally, no longer secured against store property at all, since as trustee, I formally disclaimed any trust liability for a debt incurred through forgery. Bradley faced the debt alone, plus the bank's internal fraud flag, which meant no line of credit anywhere in the county would look kindly on his name again for a long while. He avoided criminal charges, in the end, largely because I asked Walter not to push for them. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, not yet. I'd spent 22 years in a profession built around triage, deciding what actually needs treating and what can be left to heal on its own. I decided Bradley's public financial ruin, delivered swiftly and completely, was consequence enough, without adding a courtroom to a family that had already lost enough. Marcus and I sat down together the second week after the reception. We went through 3 years of inventory records, line by line, the same patient, procedural work I'd once watched Thomas do at that same desk on Sunday evenings. What we found matched almost exactly what Thomas's letter had described. Small amounts, skimmed steadily, never large enough alone to trip an audit. $400 here, disguised as a supplier refund that never happened. $600 there, logged as damaged inventory write-off for merchandise that had in fact been sold in full. Across 3 years, the total came to just over $18,000 beyond the forged $61,000 credit line itself, a separate, quieter theft that had simply never been large enough on any single day to catch anyone's attention. He was careful, Marcus said, closing the ledger at last. Careful the way a man gets when he's scared, not the way a man gets when he's actually good at something. I didn't pursue that $18,000 as aggressively as the credit line fraud, structuring a repayment arrangement instead, through Walter. $25 a week for a while, then $50 once Bradley's second job stabilized. A slow, deliberate restitution that cost him time and discipline rather than a courtroom and a record. It felt, to me, like the kind of consequence that actually changes a person, rather than simply punishing them. Carol's reckoning came in a different shape. The title company inquiry Walter had mentioned in that fellowship hall turned out to have gone further than a casual conversation. Carol had, in fact, signed a non-binding letter of intent with the hardware chain, representing herself as having authority to sell property she'd never actually owned. That letter, once it surfaced during probate, exposed her to a civil claim from the hardware chain for wasted due diligence costs, nearly $9,000. A debt that was entirely hers to answer for, No trust and no forged signature standing between her and the consequence of her own signature this time. She called me twice in the weeks after the reception. I let both calls go to voicemail. The first was defensive, full of the old certainty, insisting I'd manipulated Thomas somehow. That no reasonable son cuts his own mother out so completely without someone else's influence at work. The second, 3 weeks later, was quieter. She didn't apologize, not directly, not in so many words, but she said something I turned over for a long time afterward. I don't know how I got everything about you so wrong for so long, Adrian. I'm not asking you to fix that. I just wanted you to know I heard myself finally when Walter read that clause. I heard exactly how I've sounded for 18 years. I didn't call her back right away. Some wounds need longer than a voicemail to decide what they're willing to hold. The store reopened 6 weeks after the funeral, under its old name, Marsh Hardware. The sign repainted by a local sign shop in the same green and gold it had worn since 1971, at my request. Some things Thomas built deserved to stay exactly as familiar as they'd always been, even with new hands running the register. I hired Marcus, the longtime clerk, to manage daily operations. He knew the inventory better than I ever would. He'd earned, over 15 years, a kind of trust that doesn't come with a title. Nia started working there part-time that same summer, learning the register the way Thomas had once taught her to change a tire, patient and unhurried. She told me, 3 weeks in, that she'd decided for certain on nursing school. Inspired, she said, by watching you handle an entire family meltdown without raising your voice once, and then go stock shelves the next morning like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. I want to be honest about that too. It cost something, all of it. The 18 years, the 11 weeks of grief, the 8 minutes in that fellowship hall when an entire family's version of reality came apart in front of casserole dishes and cheap champagne. But it cost less than 18 more years of small, constant erasure would have cost me. Thomas, in the only gift he had left to give, made sure I never had to find that out the hard way. I remember one afternoon that July with particular clarity, Nia behind the register, ringing up a bag of nails for an elderly man I recognized from the funeral. The same porch step widow's neighbor Thomas used to give a discount to without ever mentioning it out loud. Nia gave him the same quiet discount, unprompted. She'd apparently absorbed the habit simply from being around the place long enough. When he thanked her, confused about the math, she just said, "family discount," and left it there, the way Thomas always had. I stood in the back office doorway watching that exchange. I felt something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with continuity. The particular quiet satisfaction of watching a good habit outlive the person who built it. Passed on without a single word of instruction, just proximity and example, and enough time to notice what mattered. Bradley called me in late July, almost 2 months after the reception. His voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. None of the old, easy confidence he'd carried around a business he'd never actually built. He asked if he could come by the store. Not to ask for anything, he said, just to see it. And maybe to apologize properly, in person, the way a phone call doesn't quite allow. I said yes. I'm not entirely sure why, except that 22 years of nursing has taught me that most people are more than the worst 18 months of their life, even the ones who did real damage getting there. I wanted to see, with my own eyes, which version of Bradley Marsh was going to walk through that door. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, the store quiet, Marcus in the back doing inventory, Nia at the register counting change. He stood just inside the door for a long moment before he spoke, taking in the repainted sign, the same green and gold, the same coffee can by the register, refilled now with Nia's careful handwriting on a new index card taped to the front. "I owe you an apology that's actually specific," he said. Not the kind I gave in that fellowship hall, where I was mostly apologizing for getting caught. Go on, I said. I told myself for 3 years that I was borrowing, not stealing, that I'd put it back before anyone noticed. I never did the math on how long before anyone noticed actually was, because doing the math would have meant admitting I already knew the answer. He looked down at his hands. Thomas found it and never said a word to my face. I've had a lot of time to sit with what that means. He gave me 18 months to fix it myself, quietly, without ever forcing me to be humiliated in front of the whole family. I didn't take it. I let a dead man's mercy run out instead of using it. That's a hard thing to sit with, I said. I meant it plainly, without softening it, because it was true. Bradley, for the first time in 18 years, seemed capable of hearing something hard without deflecting it. I'm working 2 jobs now, he said, paying the bank back on a schedule that's going to take me most of a decade. I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you because I want you to know I'm not running from it anymore. I believe you, I said, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did. He asked, before he left, whether he could stop by occasionally. Not to work, not yet. Just to help Marcus with inventory the way he used to when he was younger, when the store still felt like something he'd earned rather than something he'd taken for granted. I told him he could, on the condition that Marcus set the terms. Marcus was the one whose trust actually mattered in that building now. Carol and I spoke properly for the first time in September, 4 months after the funeral, at a coffee shop in Cedar Fork neither of us had ever been to together. Chosen deliberately, I think, by both of us, as neutral ground with no history attached to it. She looked smaller than I remembered her, not physically, in some quieter way. The particular diminishment of a person who's had to reconsider a story about themselves they'd been telling for 74 years. I'm not going to pretend I understand everything I did, Carol said, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer. I've had a lot of quiet months to think about the shape of it. I told myself for 18 years I was being gracious, letting Thomas make his own choices, tolerating something I didn't fully understand. I never once asked myself what it cost you to be tolerated instead of welcomed. I'm asking myself that now. It's not a comfortable question. No, I said. It isn't. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, she said. I don't think I've earned that yet. And I'm old enough to know the difference between earning something and simply wanting it badly. But I would like the chance to earn it, slowly, if you'll let me. I'd like to know my great-nephews and nieces, if Bradley ever has any. I'd like to see the store again, someday, not as an owner, just as a customer, the way I should have been treating it, and you, for a very long time. I sat with that for a while before answering. The same way I sit with a difficult diagnosis before delivering it to a family, giving the moment the weight it deserves rather than rushing past it for anyone's comfort, including my own. I can do slowly, I said finally. I can't do pretending none of it happened. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it starts from where we actually are, not from some version of the last 18 years that never existed. That's fair, Carol said. For the first time in 18 years, I believed she meant something she said to me completely, without a second layer underneath it. Before we parted that afternoon, Carol mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd finally settled the civil claim from the hardware chain, paying the full $8,700 out of her own retirement savings rather than contesting it. A decision she said she'd made because fighting it would have meant arguing I didn't know what I clearly should have known, and I'm done doing that particular kind of arguing. It wasn't restitution to me directly. It didn't need to be. It was, I understood, the first entirely honest financial decision I'd ever watched Carol Marsh make in 18 years of knowing her. We didn't hug, We didn't cry. We finished our coffee and agreed to try again in a month. A small, deliberately modest beginning. The kind that doesn't make for a dramatic scene but does, I've found, make for the only kind of change that actually holds. Denise remarried the following spring, a quiet ceremony at a small chapel outside town. She married a kind, unremarkable man named Curtis, who ran the county's small engine repair shop and had known Denise for exactly the amount of time it takes patience to become something worth trusting. She asked me, of all the people in her life, to stand beside her during the vows. A request that moved me more than I expected it to, given everything we'd both weathered inside and around that family. Bradley came to the wedding too, sober and steady. The two of them managed a brief civil conversation near the punch bowl that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier. Proof, I thought, watching them, that even the most damaged relationships can find some small, workable version of peace if both people are finally willing to be honest about what actually happened between them. Nia graduated that following spring with early acceptance into a nursing program 2 hours from Cedar Fork. I drove her to orientation myself, the two of us in my car with the windows down, the same stretch of Highway 29 I'd driven home on the night Walter first showed me Thomas's trust. You ever think about how different this would all be? Nia asked, somewhere around the county line, if Uncle Thomas hadn't done what he did? If he'd just left things to a regular will? Or nothing at all? I thought about that question longer than the distance between exits usually allows. I think I would have survived it either way, I said. I'd survived 18 years of smaller versions of the same disrespect, but I don't think I would have believed the way I believe now that somebody truly saw me the whole time, even when I couldn't see it myself. That's what he actually left me, not the store, not the house, the proof that I was never invisible to the one person whose seeing actually mattered. Nia didn't say anything for a while after that. She just reached over and turned the radio up slightly. The way you do when a conversation has said everything it needs to say and doesn't require a bow tied on top of it. A year passed the way years do after something like this. Slower in the immediate months, and then, somehow, all at once. I kept my job at Cedar Fork Regional. I'd built too much of myself into that work to walk away from it just because the rest of my life had changed. Some kinds of steadiness matter more once you've had one kind of steadiness taken from you. Marcus ran the store's daily operations with the same quiet competence he'd shown for 15 years. Bradley did, eventually, start coming by 2 afternoons a week, not the 3 he used to disappear for. Restocking shelves and running the register under Marcus's patient direction. Slowly rebuilding something that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with earning a place back inside a family he'd nearly cost himself entirely. He finished paying off the $18,000 from the inventory, skimming a full year ahead of the schedule Walter had drawn up. Working the second job the entire time without complaint. The day he made the final payment, he came by the store just to tell me himself. Standing awkwardly by the register, the way a much younger version of him might have stood waiting to be scolded. "That's it," he said. "Paid in full. I know it doesn't undo anything. I just wanted you to know I finished it." "I know," I said. "I've seen every payment come through." "I never doubted you'd finish it, Bradley. That was never really the question." "What was the question?" he asked. "Whether you'd become somebody worth trusting again in the meantime?" I said. "I think you're getting there." He didn't say anything else. Just nodded. The particular nod of a man accepting a verdict he'd worked hard for and still wasn't entirely sure he deserved. He went back to restocking the shelf he'd been working on before he came to find me. I repainted the coffee can by the register myself, that first spring. The same faded red it had always been. I added, beneath Thomas's original lettering, one small line in my own handwriting. For whoever needs it, no questions asked. It felt right, keeping that particular tradition exactly as unglamorous and exact as he'd always run it. Some inheritances aren't about the money at all. They're about which habits of decency you decide are worth protecting once the person who taught them to you is gone. I framed the funeral program eventually, the one with the stapled page behind it. I hung it in the small office at the back of the store where Thomas used to do the books every Sunday evening, not as a trophy, as a reminder, for me, on the days the grief still surfaces without warning, of exactly what patience and quiet documentation had been capable of when the moment finally came for both to matter. Carol visits the store now, most months, always as a customer first, buying nails or a light bulb or garden shears she probably doesn't need, lingering afterward to talk with Marcus or with Nia when she's home from school, or occasionally, carefully, with me. We are not what either of us would have called close. Not yet. Maybe not ever fully. But we're honest with each other now in a way 18 years of careful tolerance never once allowed us to be. Honest, I've learned, is worth more than close most days, when close was never real to begin with. I went back to Mount Zion that same fall. I sat in the same back pew. I told Pastor Odell how it had all played out. The toast and the throat clear and the champagne nobody finished drinking. Accurate got you your justice, he said. When I finished, same as your grandmother always said it would. It took 18 years, I said. Most worthwhile things do, he said, and patted my hand once, the same way he had at my grandmother's funeral 30 years earlier. I understood, sitting there, that some kinds of patience get handed down in a family the same way a store or a house or a hidden trust does, quietly, without ceremony, waiting for the moment you finally need to use them. I think about that fellowship hall sometimes. The champagne and the cocktail napkins printed with a phrase Carol never got to keep the meaning of. I think about Thomas's handwriting on that letter, a man quietly building an entire second life raft for me while he still had the strength to hold a pen. I think about 22 years of charting, choosing the record over the argument, trusting that the truth, written down plainly enough, eventually speaks louder than anyone's voice raised over it. I think, too, about the $40 in that unsigned envelope from years earlier. I understand it differently now than I did the week it arrived. Somebody in that country club dining room, watching a maitre d' decide where I belonged before he'd even asked my name, had felt compelled to say, quietly and anonymously, that what happened wasn't right. 18 years later, a notary in a gray suit said the same thing out loud in front of everyone, with considerably more force. Both mattered. Both, in their own way, were somebody choosing accuracy over comfortable silence. I never raised mine. Not once, in 18 years. Not in that fellowship hall. Not in any of the rooms before it where I was told in 100 different ways exactly what I was and wasn't allowed to be. I didn't need to. I just kept the chart, and when the time finally came, I let it speak for itself. Denise asked me once, not long after the wedding, whether I ever felt like I'd gotten a fair trade. 18 years of quiet exclusion for one afternoon of vindication, however complete. I told her the truth, the same truth I'd tell anyone who asked. It was never about the trade. It was about finally being seen for exactly who I'd been the entire time. Competent and patient and worth building a future around, by the one person whose opinion I'd never once had to fight for. Everyone else's seeing, in the end, was simply catching up to what Thomas had known from the very beginning. He never needed a courtroom or a fellowship hall full of witnesses to know exactly who his wife was. He only built the room where everyone else would finally have to catch up. On a Saturday he never lived to see. At a reception he never got to attend. Using nothing louder than a folder, a notary, and one clause read plainly out loud. Some mornings now, I still unlock the store at 5 sharp, the way Thomas used to. Coffee in one hand, keys in the other, the green and gold sign catching the first light over Milrose Avenue. Mia's usually there within the hour, learning something new about the register or the inventory or the particular patience it takes to run a business built on trust instead of shortcuts. Marcus arrives not long after, unlocking the back office the way he has for 15 years. Some mornings Bradley's truck pulls in too, quiet and on time, a small, unremarkable fact that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. I stand in that doorway most mornings for just a moment before I turn the lights on, the way Thomas used to do it. Coffee steaming in the cool morning air. I let the quiet hold exactly as long as it needs to. Then I open the door, and I get to work.